The sun hung low over Fort Smith, Arkansas, bleeding gold across the dusty street like an open wound. Grace Ashford stood in the doorway of her father's general store, her hands stained with ink from tallying the day's receipts. She was 23 years old, and in the fading light of that May evening in 1877, she felt every one of those years pressing down on her shoulders like stones. She was about to close the door when she saw him. A man stood across the street, his silhouette dark against the amber sky. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the dusty clothes of a ranch hand, but something in the way he held himself suggested he was more than that. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but Grace could feel his gaze like a physical weight. He was watching the store. No, not the store. He was watching someone inside it. Her father. Grace's breath caught in her throat. For the past week she had felt eyes on her back when she walked through town, had noticed strangers lingering too long near their home. She had told herself it was paranoia, that the old fears were simply creeping back after all these years. But now, seeing this man standing so still, so deliberately, she knew she had not been imagining things. The stranger shifted his weight, and for a moment his face caught the dying light. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with strong features and dark eyes that held something she could not name. Grief, maybe, or anger banked so deep it had turned to cold purpose. Their eyes met across the distance. Something shifted inside her chest, a recognition without understanding, as if her soul knew this man, even though her mind had never seen him before. The moment stretched, suspended in the gold dust motes of twilight, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the lengthening shadows between buildings. She stood there long after he had gone, one hand pressed against the doorframe, her heart beating harder than it should. Inside the store, she heard her father moving about, closing up for the night. Samuel Ashford was 52 years old, his hair more silver than brown, now his face lined with what he called the marks of honest work. But Grace had learned to read the deeper lines, the ones that spoke of secrets kept and sleep lost. Especially in the past few days, he had been jumpy, looking out windows, starting at sudden noises. He knew something, or feared something. And now, this stranger watching, with eyes full of purpose. Grace closed the door and locked it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the key. That night she wrote in her diary by candlelight, the words flowing in her careful script across pages that no one else would ever read. It was a habit she had learned from her sister Abigail, who had kept her own diary until the day she disappeared 5 years ago. Grace had found Abigail's journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their shared room, but most of the final pages had been torn out, leaving only fragments of fear and cryptic warnings. Tonight Grace wrote about the stranger with the dark eyes, about the feeling of being watched, about the way her father's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. She wrote until the candle burned low and her eyes grew heavy, but sleep, when it finally came, brought no rest. She dreamed of shadows and secrets of her sister's face, pale in moonlight, of blood on dusty streets. She did not know that before the week was out, she would understand that dreams sometimes know what waking minds refuse to see. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that promised to bake the life out of everything it touched. Grace woke early, as she always did, and dressed in her simple blue cotton dress, pinning her dark hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and saw what everyone in Fort Smith saw: a respectable young woman, a dutiful daughter, perhaps a bit too serious, a bit too quiet, but pleasant enough. They did not see what lay beneath. After breakfast, which her father ate in distracted silence, Grace told him she was going to visit Mrs. Henderson, who had been feeling poorly. It was not entirely a lie. She would visit Mrs. Henderson, but first she had other business. She walked through the awakening town, nodding to shopkeepers, sweeping their storefronts, to women carrying baskets to market, to children running barefoot through the dust. Fort Smith was growing, they said, becoming civilized, but to Grace it would always be the place where her sister had died, where justice had failed, where secrets festered in the foundations like rot. At the edge of town, where the neat buildings gave way to ramshackle structures and rough camps, Grace came to a small cabin that leaned slightly to one side. This was where she came 3 mornings a week, where she taught reading and writing to those the town preferred to forget, the children of former slaves, the daughters of washerwomen and day laborers, the ones who would never set foot in the proper schoolhouse on Main Street. She did this in secret, of course. Her father knew but pretended not to, understanding that some battles were not worth fighting in a town like Fort Smith. But Grace fought them anyway, quietly, persistently, teaching letters to small hands that would otherwise never hold a book. She did it for Abigail. Her sister had believed in education, had smuggled books to the children who worked in the fields, had dreamed of a school where anyone could learn, regardless of the color of their skin or the depth of their father's pockets. When Abigail died, Grace had taken up that dream like a torch, carrying it through the darkness that had swallowed her sister whole. This morning, 7 children waited for her, ranging in age from 6 to 14. They sat on rough benches, slates in hand, eyes bright with a hunger to learn. Grace smiled at them, feeling some of the weight lift from her chest. Here at least she could do something that mattered. She was helping young Sarah practice her letters when she felt it again, the sensation of being watched. Grace looked up sharply, scanning the area around the canyon. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a stand of cottonwood trees, she spotted him, the stranger from yesterday evening. He stood perfectly still, and even from this distance, Grace could see that his attention was focused entirely on her, not on the children, not on the cabin, on her. Her pulse quickened. She should have been afraid, perhaps alone here with just children for company, but what she felt was not fear. It was something more complicated, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, and that same strange recognition that had struck her the day before. She made a decision. After dismissing the children with their assignments for the next lesson, Grace walked deliberately toward the trees where the stranger stood. She half expected him to disappear again, to melt back into the shadows like a ghost, but he did not move. He waited, watching her approach with those dark, unreadable eyes. As she drew closer, she could see him more clearly in the morning light. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with strong features that looked like they had been carved from hard wood rather than sculpted from clay. His jaw was dark with several days' stubble and a scar, small but noticeable, cut through his left eyebrow. He wore simple clothes, a cowboy's garb, but something in his bearing suggested education, intelligence, a life lived beyond the boundaries of ranch work. Grace stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to maintain propriety. "You have been following me," she said. It was not a question. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was deep, quiet, with the faint trace of an accent she could not quite place. Tennessee, maybe, or Kentucky. "I apologize for that. It was not my intention to frighten you." "I am not frightened," Grace replied, which was mostly true. "I am curious. Why are you watching me? Or is it my father you are watching?" Something flickered across his face at the mention of her father, gone so quickly she almost missed it. Pain, perhaps, or hatred. "Both," he said finally, with a honesty that surprised her, "though I did not mean for you to notice. I am not usually so careless." "Who are you?" "Garrett Cole, ma'am. Recently hired on at the Blackwell Ranch." "And what business do you have with my father, Mr. Cole?" Another pause, longer this time. Garrett Cole looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold years of weariness, and when he spoke his words were chosen carefully. "I am looking into some old business, Miss Ashford. Business from before I came to Fort Smith. I believe your father might have information that could help me." "What kind of business?" "The kind that gets people killed." The blunt words hung in the air between them like a threat. Her spine went cold despite the morning heat. "Are you threatening my father, Mr. Cole?" "No, ma'am," he said, and she believed him. "I am trying to find the truth, but truth and threat sometimes look the same from a distance." Grace studied his face, searching for deception and finding only a bone-deep exhaustion that matched her own. This man, she realized, carried ghosts just as she did. "The truth about what?" she asked softly. Garrett Cole looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It was the look of a man who wanted desperately to speak, but knew that words once released could never be taken back. "About a fire in Tennessee 5 years ago," he said finally. "About the people who died in that fire. About the men who caused it and then walked away without consequence." 5 years ago. the same year Abigail died. Grace's mind raced, making connections she did not fully understand. Before she could speak, Garrett continued, "I do not mean to involve you in this, Miss Ashford. You seem like a good woman doing good work." He gestured toward the cabin where she had been teaching. "But I needed to know what kind of person you were before I approached your father, whether you were part of it or just another victim." "Part of what?" Grace demanded, her voice sharper now. "What are you accusing my father of?" "Nothing yet," Garrett said. "But I have questions, and he has answers, whether he knows it or not." He put his hat back on, preparing to leave. "Wait," Grace said. "When will you speak to him?" "When the time is right." "And when will that be?" Garrett Cole looked at her one more time, and in his eyes Grace saw a sadness so profound it made her chest ache. "Soon," he said. "Very soon." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone among the cottonwoods, her mind spinning with questions she did not know how to ask. She did not know that she had less than 3 days before those questions would be answered in blood and gunfire. The days that followed were strange, haunted by Garrett Cole's presence, even when she could not see him. Grace found herself looking for him everywhere, scanning crowds for his tall figure, listening for his voice among the sounds of the town. She told herself it was caution, that she needed to know where he was and what he was doing. But deep down, she knew it was something more. She could not stop thinking about what he had said. A fire in Tennessee, people who died, men who walked away. That night, unable to sleep, Grace climbed up into the attic of their house and pulled out the old trunk where her mother's things were stored. She had not opened it in years, had avoided it the way one avoids a grave. But now, driven by a need she could not name, she lifted the lid. Inside, beneath her mother's wedding dress and letters tied with faded ribbon, she found her father's old papers. Deeds, contracts, business correspondence. She sorted through them by lantern light, not sure what she was looking for until her fingers touched a folder marked 1872. The year before Abigail died, the year her father had suddenly come into money. Grace opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were documents for a land deal in Tennessee. A consortium of 5 men purchasing railroad property. The names jumped out at her: Samuel Ashford, Thomas Cole, Emmett Walsh, and 2 others she did not recognize. Thomas Cole. Garrett's father. Grace sat back on her heels, the papers scattered around her, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What did this mean? Her father had been in business with Garrett's father. And now Garrett was here asking questions about a fire that had killed people. She thought about the look in Garrett's eyes, the weight of grief he carried. She thought about Abigail, about the fear that had shadowed her sister's final weeks. She thought about her father's trembling hands and his refusal to meet her gaze. And for the first time in 5 years, Grace allowed herself to wonder if the official story of Abigail's death, the convenient conclusion of an unfortunate accident, might have been a lie. The thought, once admitted, could not be unthought. Grace gathered the papers and returned them to the trunk, but she took one document with her, folding it carefully and hiding it in the bottom of her own drawer. Evidence of what she did not yet know, but she would find out. She would find the truth no matter what it cost. The gunshot, when it came, sounded like the world breaking. It was late afternoon on a Thursday, 5 days after Grace had first seen Garrett Cole watching her father's store. She was walking home from the post office, her marketing basket over her arm, thinking about the letter she had just mailed to a teacher's college in St. Louis. It was a small dream, a fragile hope, but lately she had been thinking more and more about leaving Fort Smith, about building a life somewhere the shadows of the past could not reach. She never saw Emmett Walsh step out from between the buildings, never saw him raise the pistol with shaking hands, but she heard his voice thick with rage and whiskey cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. "This is for 1872, Ashford." Grace turned, her basket falling from nerveless fingers, apples scattering across the dirt street. Walsh stood 20 feet away, the gun pointed directly at her chest. His face was twisted with grief and fury, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. Grace saw the hammer of the pistol pulling back, saw Walsh's finger tightening on the trigger, saw her death approaching with the cold inevitability of winter. Then strong hands slammed into her shoulders, shoving her violently to the side. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, her vision blurring. Above her, a man's body twisted, trying to shield her completely. She caught a glimpse of his face recognition flooding through her, even in that split second of chaos. Garrett Cole. The gun fired. The sound was deafening, final, like the closing of a door that could never be opened again. Grace felt Garrett's body jerk, felt his weight suddenly become dead and heavy as he collapsed half across her. His shoulder pressing against her chest, his blood already beginning to seep through the blue cotton of his shirt. "Mr. Cole," she gasped, her hands coming up instinctively to try to support him. His face had gone ashen, his jaw clenched against the pain, but his eyes found hers with startling clarity. "Are you hurt?" He managed, his voice strained but steady. "No," she said, amazed that his concern was for her when he was the one bleeding. "No, I am fine." People were shouting all around them now. She heard the blacksmith's roar of anger, heard running footsteps, heard Walsh screaming something about justice and daughters and lies. But all of it seemed distant, muffled, as if it were happening in another world entirely. The only thing that felt real was Garrett Cole's blood, warm and wet, soaking into her dress. The only thing that mattered was the question that had been burning in her mind for days, the question she had not yet found the courage to ask. But before she could speak, Garrett's lips moved close to her ear, close enough that only she could hear the words he whispered in the chaos. "Don't trust your father." Then his eyes rolled back and he went limp in her arms, unconscious from shock and blood loss, leaving Grace kneeling in the dirt with his cryptic warning echoing in her mind and his life draining away onto her skirts. The sheriff's men hauled Walsh away, still screaming, still raging. The blacksmith and two others carefully lifted Garrett's unconscious body, preparing to carry him to Dr. Matthews' office down the street. Grace scrambled to her feet, her dress heavy with blood, her hands shaking so badly she could barely make them work. "I am coming with you," she told them, her voice allowing no argument. Someone, she thought it might have been Mrs. Peterson from the dry goods store, tried to tell her to go home to change to rest, but Grace ignored them all. She followed the men carrying Garrett, her mind replaying those whispered words over and over. "Don't trust your father." And Walsh's cry, the one she had heard just before the gun fired. This is for 1872, the same year as the Tennessee land deal, the same year her father had mysteriously acquired wealth. The year before Abigail began to change, to grow fearful, to start looking over her shoulder as if expecting shadows to reach out and grab her. Grace's entire world was shifting beneath her feet, everything she thought she knew cracking apart like thin ice over a frozen lake. But she pushed the questions aside for now. First, she had to make sure Garrett Cole survived. She owed him that much. He had saved her life. But she was beginning to suspect that his reasons for being in Fort Smith, for watching her father, for taking that bullet, were far more complicated than simple heroism. Dr. Lawrence Matthews was 60 years old, with gentle eyes and hands that had sewn up more bullet wounds than he cared to remember. He took one look at Garrett's ashen face and the blood soaking through the makeshift bandages and immediately cleared everyone out of his examination room except for his nurse. "Miss Ashford," he said kindly but firmly, "you should go home. There is nothing you can do here." "I want to stay," Grace said. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Please, doctor, this man saved my life. The least I can do is wait to hear if he will survive." "Doctor." Matthews studied her blood-stained dress, her pale face, the determined set of her jaw. He sighed. "Very well, but wait outside while I work. If I need you, I will call." Grace nodded and allowed herself to be ushered into the small waiting room. She sank onto a wooden bench, suddenly aware of how much she was shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her this far was beginning to drain away, leaving behind a cold, hollow feeling. She looked down at her hands. They were stained dark with Garrett's blood. She should wash them, she thought distantly. She should do something, but she could not seem to make herself move. The door to the examination room was thin. She could hear Dr. Matthews moving about, could hear the clink of metal instruments, could hear the low murmur of voices. Once she thought she heard Garrett groan, a sound of such pain that it made her flinch. Time passed, strangely, stretching and contracting like something alive. Grace did not know if minutes or hours had gone by when the door finally opened and her father burst into the waiting room, his face pale and frightened. "Grace!" Samuel Ashford rushed to her, his hands reaching for her shoulders, his eyes scanning her frantically. "Are you hurt? I heard there was a shooting, that you were there, that—" He trailed off as he saw the blood on her dress. "It is not mine," Grace said quietly. "The man inside took the bullet meant for me." Her father's face, already pale, went absolutely white. His hands, still gripping her shoulders, began to tremble. "What man?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew, already feared the answer. "Garrett Cole, a cowboy from the Blackwell Ranch." Samuel Ashford released her as if burned. He took a step back, swaying slightly, and Grace thought for a moment that he might actually faint. She had never seen her father look like this, never seen him so thoroughly shaken. "Father," she said, standing, "do you know him?" "No," Samuel said, but his eyes would not meet hers, and his hands shook as he reached up to remove his hat. "No, I do not know him." "Then why do you look like you have seen a ghost?" Before her father could answer, the door to the examination room opened, and Dr. Matthews emerged, his sleeves rolled up, his hands freshly washed, but still bearing traces of blood under his fingernails. Both Grace and Samuel turned to him, waiting. "I got the bullet out," Dr. Matthews said, his face grave. "It was lodged deep in his left shoulder, just below the clavicle. Another inch to the right, and it would have severed the subclavian artery. He would have bled out before I could have done anything." "Will he live?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The next few days will tell. He has lost a lot of blood. If infection sets in—" The doctor let the sentence hang unfinished. "But he is young and strong. If anyone can survive this, it would be a man like him." "Can I see him?" Dr. Matthews hesitated, glancing at her father, then back to Grace. "He is unconscious, Miss Ashford. He will not know you are there." "I know," Grace said, "but I need to see him. Please." The doctor nodded slowly and stepped aside, allowing her to enter the room. Garrett Cole lay on the examination table, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his bronzed skin unnaturally pale. Someone had removed his shirt, and Grace could see the lean musculature of his torso, the scars that spoke of a hard life, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In unconsciousness, with his face relaxed, he looked younger, more vulnerable. But there was still something in the set of his features, even in sleep, that spoke of determination and will. Grace moved closer, drawn by a force she did not understand. She looked down at the man who had thrown himself between her and a bullet, who had whispered warnings with what he must have thought was his dying breath, who had been watching her and her father for reasons she was only beginning to guess at. "Who are you?" she whispered to his unconscious form. "What do you want from us?" He did not answer, of course, but his breathing remained steady, and Grace found herself oddly comforted by that simple rhythm. He was alive. For now, that had to be enough. Behind her, she heard Dr. Matthews speaking to her father in low tones. She caught fragments of the conversation. "Critical condition, round the clock here. Someone should stay with him." Grace made a decision. She turned and walked back out to the waiting room, her mind clear and focused for the first time since the gunshot had shattered the afternoon. "I will stay with him," she announced. Both men looked at her in surprise. "Grace, that is not necessary," her father began. "The doctor can—" "I will stay," Grace repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "This man saved my life, Father. The least I can do is make sure he recovers." "Miss Ashford," Dr. Matthews said gently, "nursing a gunshot victim is not easy work. It may take days. You would be better served going home resting, changing your clothes." "I nursed my mother through consumption for 8 months before she died," Grace said quietly. "I know how to change bandages. I know how to bring down a fever. I know how to sit vigil through the dark hours." She looked between the two men, her jaw set. "I am staying." Dr. Matthews glanced at her father, who looked like he wanted to protest but could not find the words. Finally, the doctor nodded. "Very well. I have a cot in the back room if you need to rest. And, Miss Ashford," he met her eyes seriously, "if his condition worsens, if the fever spikes, or the wound begins to seep badly, you must call me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor." After giving her detailed instructions on how to care for Garrett, Dr. Matthews left to attend to other patients, promising to return to check on his patient in a few hours. Samuel lingered, clearly wanting to say something, but Grace kept her back to him, focusing on the basin of cool water and clean cloths the doctor had provided. "Grace," her father finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "there are things you do not understand. "Then explain them to me," Grace said, still not turning around. A long silence. "I cannot," Samuel said at last, the words barely audible. "Not yet. Please just come home. Let the doctor handle this." "No, Grace." "I said no, Father." She finally turned to look at him, and the expression on her face must have told him that arguing was useless. "Go home. I will send word if anything changes." Samuel Ashford stood there a moment longer, looking old and defeated, then nodded once and left. Grace listened to his footsteps fading down the hallway, heard the outside door open and close, and only then did she allow herself to release the breath she had been holding. She was alone with Garrett Cole, and a growing certainty that nothing in her life would ever be the same. The first night was the hardest. But Grace sat in a straight-backed chair beside Garrett's bed, a basin of cool water on the small table next to her, fresh bandages folded and ready. As twilight deepened into full darkness outside the window, Garrett's breathing grew more labored, his skin hot to the touch. The fever had set in. Grace had expected this. Dr. Matthews had warned her. But knowing it was coming did not make it any easier to watch as Garrett began to toss restlessly, muttering incomprehensible words, his face twisting with pain and delirium. She dipped a cloth in the cool water, wrung it out, and gently bathed his face and neck, trying to bring down the fever. Her hands, steady and sure, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, who had sat vigil beside a sickbed and fought death with nothing but cool water and stubborn determination. "Easy," she murmured, though she doubted he could hear her. "You are safe now. Just rest." But Garrett did not rest. As the fever climbed higher, his mutterings grew more distinct, fragments of words coalescing into names, into pleas, into accusations. "Sarah!" he gasped, his good hand clenching into a fist. "Sarah, hold on! Please hold on!" Grace's hand paused in its gentle ministrations. Sarah. A wife? A sister? Someone he had loved and lost. "Pa!" Garrett moaned his head, turning restlessly on the pillow. "Pa, wake up! The house is burning! Wake up! The house is burning!" Ice spread through her veins. She thought of the papers she had found in her father's trunk. The land deal in Tennessee, the name Thomas Cole. She thought of what Garrett had said about a fire 5 years ago, about people who had died. Had he lost his family in a fire? Had Thomas Cole been his father? "Jimmy!" Garrett cried out suddenly, his voice breaking with anguish. "Jimmy, don't die. Please, God, don't let him die." Grace gripped his hand without thinking, her fingers closing around his fevered ones. "Shh," she said softly. "They are at peace now. You have to let them rest." Whether he heard her or not, she could not tell. But his thrashing subsided slightly, his breathing evening out just a fraction. Grace continued to bathe his forehead, his neck, his chest, trying desperately to bring the fever down before it consumed him entirely. Hours passed. The candles burned low. Outside, Fort Smith settled into sleep, but Grace remained awake, watching over the man who had saved her life, listening to his fevered confessions, and piecing together a story that grew more terrible with each revelation. It was near midnight when Garrett spoke again, his voice thick and slurred with fever, but clearer than before. "Ashford," he said, the name a curse on his lips. "You bastard! You killed them! You killed them all!" Grace's hand froze, the wet cloth dripping onto the blanket. "My family," Garrett continued, his eyes still closed, lost in whatever nightmare the fever had conjured. "My Sarah, my Jimmy, my Pa, all of them burning, screaming, and you just walked away. You took your blood money and you walked away." Tears stung Grace's eyes. She did not know if what Garrett was saying was true or simply the ravings of a fever-addled mind, but the pain in his voice was real, the grief was real, and it called to something deep inside her own wounded heart. "I will find you," Garrett whispered, his voice fading as exhaustion pulled him back toward unconsciousness. "I will find the truth. I will make you pay." Then he was quiet, sinking into a restless sleep that was not quite rest, but at least was not the violent delirium of before. Grace sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She looked at the man lying so still before her, saw the bandages covering the wound he had taken for her, remembered the warning he had whispered, "Don't trust your father." What had her father done? What role had he played in the deaths of Garrett's family? And what did any of it have to do with Abigail? Grace knew she should be loyal to her father, should defend him against these accusations. But loyalty required trust, and she was beginning to realize that she had not truly trusted her father in 5 years, not since the day Abigail's body had been pulled from the river and the sheriff had called it an accident with suspicious haste. Some part of her, buried deep beneath duty and denial, had always known that something was wrong, had always sensed the rot beneath the respectable surface of their lives. Now that part of her was clawing its way to the light, demanding answers. Grace rose from her chair and crossed to the small desk where Dr. Matthews kept his supplies. She knew Garrett's personal effects would be there, the things that had been removed when the doctor treated his wound. She should not look. It was a violation of privacy of trust, but she was done pretending, done accepting lies, done living in the comfortable darkness of ignorance. She opened the drawer. Inside she found Garrett's holster and gun neatly set aside. His hat, his pocket watch, a small leather bag that clinked with the weight of coins, and beneath it all a worn leather satchel. Grace's hands trembled as she lifted the satchel out and opened it. The first thing she saw was a photograph, old and faded, but still clear enough. It showed a family, a strong-looking man with kind eyes, a woman with a gentle smile, 2 boys and a young girl of perhaps 16. They stood in front of a simple house, their faces full of hope and promise frozen in a moment before tragedy struck. Grace studied the photograph, her heart aching. This was Garrett's family. His father Thomas, who had shared a business venture with her own father, his mother, his brothers, his sister Sarah. She looked closer at the girl in the photograph, at her delicate features and dark hair, and felt her breath catch. Sarah Cole looked exactly like Abigail, not just similar, nearly identical. The same heart-shaped face, the same wide eyes, the same slight build. If Grace had not known better, she would have thought she was looking at a photograph of her own sister. What did it mean? Was it just coincidence? Or was there some connection between the 2 girls, some link between their deaths? Grace set the photograph aside with shaking hands and pulled out the next item, a piece of paper yellowed with age and much folded. Grace paused, looking back at Sarah's photograph. The resemblance to Abigail was uncanny. Same delicate features, same dark hair, same age when they died. Was it coincidence, or had Blackwood deliberately chosen girls who looked alike, some twisted pattern only he understood? The thought made her sick. These girls were not random victims. They were selected, hunted, killed because they fit some criteria in a monster's mind. She forced herself to continue searching through the satchel. She opened it carefully. It was a list of names written in a neat hand. Thomas Cole, deceased 1872, Emmett Walsh, Fort Smith, Arkansas, Samuel Ashford, Fort Smith, Arkansas, John Mercer, location unknown, Robert Hastings, deceased 1873. Next to Samuel Ashford's name, someone had written in darker ink 1872, still alive. Daughter. Grace stared at the word daughter and felt sick. The final item in the satchel was a bullet, old and tarnished, with words carefully scratched into its surface. For Sarah. Grace held the bullet in her palm, feeling its weight, understanding what it meant. Garrett had carried this bullet for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to use it, waiting to deliver justice or revenge or whatever he called the thing that had driven him across states and years to Fort Smith, to her father. She carefully replaced everything in the satchel, her hands steadier, now her mind cold and clear. When she returned to her chair beside Garrett's bed, she was no longer the same woman who had sat down there hours before. She had crossed a line, had chosen a side, though she was not yet sure what the sides were or what the battle would cost. Garrett stirred his eyes, fluttering open briefly. They were glazed with fever, unfocused, but they found her face and held it for a moment. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question barely audible. Grace leaned closer, making sure he could see her clearly. "I am Grace Ashford," she said softly, "and I think we have the same enemy." His eyes widened slightly, and she saw understanding flicker there, brief and bright, before the fever pulled him back under. But in that moment of clarity, something had passed between them, an alliance, a recognition, a promise. Grace settled back in her chair and took up the damp cloth again, resuming her patient work of trying to keep Garrett Cole alive. But now she was not doing it out of simple gratitude or duty. She was doing it because she needed him, needed his knowledge, his evidence, his determination to uncover truths that had been buried for too long. And perhaps, though she barely admitted it even to herself, she needed him because he was the first person in 5 years who seemed to understand that the world was not what it appeared, that beneath the surface of respectability and order ran currents of darkness and blood. He was like her, wounded by the past, haunted by ghosts, driven by a hunger for truth that refused to be satisfied with comfortable lies. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, Garrett's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, his thrashing stilled, and he fell into what seemed to be true sleep rather than fevered unconsciousness. Grace allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment, exhaustion finally catching up with her. When Dr. Matthews arrived to check on his patient a few hours later, he found Grace asleep in her chair, her hand still resting lightly on Garrett's arm, her face peaceful despite the blood staining her dress and the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. The doctor smiled softly and chose not to wake her. She had earned her rest, and Garrett Cole, against all odds, was still alive. Outside, Fort Smith was waking to a new day, unaware that the events of the previous afternoon had set in motion a chain of revelations that would shake the town to its foundations. Unaware that in a small room above the doctor's office, 2 wounded souls had found each other in the darkness and forged an alliance that would either save them both or destroy them completely. The vigil had only just begun. Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of birds singing their morning chorus. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she did not remember where she was. Then awareness returned, the blood on her dress now dried and stiff, the ache in her neck from sleeping in the chair, and Garrett Cole still breathing steadily in the bed beside her. She sat up quickly, her hand going to his forehead. The fever had broken completely. His skin was cool to the touch, his breathing deep and even. As if sensing her attention, his eyes opened clearer now than they had been since the shooting. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Grace withdrew her hand, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the gesture, of how it must look, her sitting here, in her blood-stained dress, having spent the night at his bedside. "I did," she said simply. Garrett's eyes moved to take in the room, the bandages wrapped around his shoulder, the early morning light. When his gaze returned to her face, there was something new in it. Wariness, perhaps, or recognition that something had shifted between them in the night. "What did I say?" he asked. "When the fever had me." Grace considered lying. It would have been the easier path, the safer one. But she had spent 5 years living with lies and half-truths, and she was done with safety. "You called out names," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "Sarah, Jimmy, your father. You spoke of a fire of people dying." She paused. "You accused my father of murder." Garrett closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. When he opened them again, the wariness had hardened into something more guarded. "I apologize," he said. "Fever makes a man say things he should keep to himself. Does it make him lie?" The question hung between them, sharp and challenging. Garrett studied her face, and she could see him making calculations, deciding how much truth he could afford to give. "No," he said finally. "Fever does not make a man lie. It just strips away the careful words and leaves the raw truth bleeding." Grace nodded slowly. She stood and crossed to the small desk, returning with the leather satchel. She set it on the bed beside him, watching his face as recognition dawned. "You looked through my things." "I did." She felt no shame about it. "I found your photograph, your list of names, the bullet." Garrett's good hand moved to the satchel, his fingers tracing its worn edge, but he did not open it. He did not need to. He knew what she had seen. "Then you know why I came to Fort Smith," he said quietly. "I know you believe my father was involved in your family's deaths. I know you have been planning something, though I do not yet know what." Grace sat back down in the chair, leaning forward so he could not escape her gaze. "What I do not know is whether you are right. You doubt me. I doubt everyone," Grace said, and there was a bitterness in her voice that surprised even her. "My father has been lying to me for 5 years, perhaps longer. The sheriff called my sister's death an accident when I know in my bones it was not. This entire town is built on secrets and convenient blindness." She took a breath. "So yes, Mr. Cole, I doubt you, but I also doubt him, and I need to know the truth." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its guard. "Tell me about your sister." The request caught Grace off balance. She had expected him to defend himself, to present his case against her father. She had not expected him to ask about Abigail. "Why? Because I saw your face when you looked at Sarah's photograph. You recognized something. Not just the resemblance, though, that is there. Something deeper." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had not cried for Abigail in 3 years, had locked her grief away in the same place she kept all the questions she was not supposed to ask. "Abigail was my younger sister," she began, her voice steady, despite the ache in her chest. "She died 5 years ago, in the summer of 1872. The official story is that she fell from her horse into the river and drowned. But Abigail was terrified of horses. She never rode if she could help it. What do you think happened? I think someone killed her. I think she saw something she was not meant to see, or knew something she was not meant to know." Grace's hands clenched in her lap. In the weeks before she died, she was frightened. She would not sleep with the lamp out. She started at every noise. And when I asked her what was wrong, she would only say that she had seen bad men doing bad things. "Did she tell your father?" "Yes, I heard them arguing one night. She was crying, begging him to do something. And he—" Grace's voice caught. "He told her to forget what she had seen. Told her it was not her concern. Told her to stay away from the warehouse district." Garrett's eyes sharpened. "The warehouse district? Yes, why?" Instead of answering directly, Garrett pushed himself up slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "Miss Ashford, Grace, I need you to understand something. I came to Fort Smith with a purpose. I meant to find the men responsible for my family's deaths and make them pay. Your father's name was on my list because he was part of a business consortium with my father in 1872. "I found the papers," Grace said, "in my father's trunk, the Tennessee land deal." Garrett nodded. "That deal was supposed to make them all rich. Railroad expansion, they said. Good, honest money. But my father discovered that the real purpose of the consortium was to use the warehouse properties to smuggle weapons, guns and ammunition being sold to Confederate holdouts and renegade Indian bands. It was treason, Miss Ashford. Treason and profit mixed together." The room tilted. Weapons smuggling. Her father involved in treason. "My father confronted the others." Garrett continued, his voice hard with old pain. "He said he would go to the authorities. A week later, our house burned in the middle of the night. My mother, my father, my brother Jimmy, my sister Sarah, all of them trapped inside, all of them burned alive." "Where were you?" "I was 18. I had gone into town that night, young and stupid, drinking and playing cards when I should have been home." The guilt in his voice was a living thing, raw and bleeding. "By the time I got back, there was nothing left but ashes and bodies." Grace reached out instinctively, her hand covering his. "It was not your fault." "No," Garrett agreed, but his eyes said he did not believe it. "It was the fault of the men who set that fire, the men who murdered my family to keep their secrets safe." He looked at her directly. "Your father was one of those men, Miss Ashford. He may not have lit the match, but he was part of the conspiracy." "You do not know that," Grace said. But even as she spoke, she remembered her father's reaction yesterday when he had seen Garrett. The fear, the guilt. "I know that after the fire, the consortium dissolved. The members scattered. Some of them became suddenly wealthy. And then over the next year, their daughters started dying. Accidents, they said, unfortunate tragedies, but there were too many of them, and they were all girls between the ages of 14 and 17. Grace's blood turned to ice. "How many? Oh, 4 that I could confirm. Thomas Cole's daughter, Sarah. Emmett Walsh's daughter, Margaret. Robert Hastings' daughter, Elizabeth. And Abigail," Grace whispered. "I did not know about her until I came here. I had no record of Samuel Ashford having children, but when I started watching your family when I saw you, I realized there must have been another daughter. And when I heard the gossip about how she died—" Garrett's hand turned, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I am sorry, Grace. I am sorry for your loss, and I am sorry that it is connected to mine in such a terrible way." They sat in silence, hands clasped, two people bound together by grief, and the growing certainty that their losses were not separate tragedies, but pieces of the same dark puzzle. Finally, Grace spoke. "If my father was involved in smuggling weapons, if he helped cover up your family's murder, then he deserves to face justice. But I need proof, Mr. Cole. I need more than suspicions and coincidences." "Garrett," he said. "If we are going to be allies in this, you should call me Garrett." "Garrett," she repeated, and something about the name on her lips felt right, felt like a promise. "I will help you find the truth, but you have to help me understand what happened to Abigail." "Agreed." "And you have to promise me something else." "What?" Grace looked at him steadily. "If we discover that my father is innocent, that he was a victim in this rather than a perpetrator, you will let go of your revenge." Garrett was quiet for a long time. Grace could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire for vengeance, warring with something else. Finally he nodded. "If he is innocent, I will let him be. You have my word." It was not everything Grace wanted, but it was enough. For now. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them pull apart, their hands separating as Dr. Matthews entered the room. If he noticed their closeness, he was diplomatic enough not to mention it. "Well, Mr. Cole," the doctor said, approaching the bed with his medical bag. "It seems you have defied my expectations. Your fever has broken, and you appear to be on the mend." "Thanks to Miss Ashford," Garrett said, his eyes meeting Grace's. "She is a skilled nurse." "Indeed, Doctor." Matthews began his examination, checking the wound, testing Garrett's range of motion. "The bullet did significant damage, but the wound is clean. No signs of infection. With proper rest and care, I believe you will make a full recovery, though your shoulder will likely pain you for some time." "How long before I can leave?" Garrett asked. "Leave my office a few days if you continue to improve. Leave your bed and resume normal activities." The doctor shook his head. "Weeks, Mr. Cole. At least 3 or 4 before you should even think about returning to ranch work. You will need someone to care for you during your recovery." Grace spoke before she could second-guess herself. "He can stay with us. We have a spare room, and I can tend to his needs." Both men looked at her in surprise. "Miss Ashford," Dr. Matthews began, "while I appreciate your generosity, it would not be proper for an unmarried woman to care for an unmarried man under the same roof." "My father will be there as chaperone," Grace said, her voice calm and reasonable, even as her heart raced. "And propriety seems a small concern when weighed against a man's life. Mr. Cole saved me from a bullet doctor. The least my family can do is ensure his recovery." She did not mention her real reasons, that she needed Garrett close if they were to investigate together, that she needed to keep him away from her father, until she understood the full truth that she needed this alliance to survive long enough to uncover the secrets that had destroyed both their families. Dr. Matthews looked uncertain, but before he could protest further, Garrett spoke. "I would be grateful for your hospitality, Miss Ashford, and I give you my word as a gentleman that I will conduct myself with complete propriety." The doctor sighed, recognizing a losing battle. "Very well, but I will check on you daily, and at the first sign of complications, you will return here. Understood?" "Understood," Garrett agreed. After the doctor left to prepare discharge papers, Grace and Garrett sat in charged silence. They both knew that this arrangement was dangerous, not because of any threat to Grace's reputation, but because it would bring Garrett face to face with Samuel Ashford, the man Garrett believed had helped murder his family, the man who was Grace's father. "Are you certain about this?" Garrett asked quietly. "No," Grace admitted. "But I am certain that I cannot live with lies anymore. Whatever the truth is, whatever it costs, I need to know." "So, even if it destroys you," Grace thought of Abigail pale and cold in her coffin, thought of 5 years of questions swallowed, of suspicions buried, of a grief that had nowhere to go because she was not allowed to acknowledge that something was wrong. "I have been destroyed already," she said. "At least this way I will know why." That afternoon, Grace finally went home to change her clothes and speak with her father. She found Samuel in the store mechanically sorting through inventory, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. He looked up when she entered, and the relief on his face was immediate and painful to see. Grace, thank God. I have been worried sick. How is the man, the cowboy who was shot? His name is Garrett Cole, Grace said, watching her father's face carefully. And he is recovering. Samuel's expression flickered, something dark passing behind his eyes at the name. That is good. That is very good. He is a brave man to take a bullet meant for another. He is, Grace agreed, which is why I have invited him to stay with us during his recovery. The color drained from her father's face. What, Grace? No, that is not appropriate. We cannot. We can and we will, Grace interrupted, her voice firm. He saved my life, Father. He deserves our care. There are other ways to show gratitude. We can pay his medical expenses, ensure he has funds for... He will stay with us. Grace moved closer, forcing her father to meet her eyes. Unless you have some reason to object. Some reason you do not want Garrett Cole under our roof. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it again. He looked trapped, cornered. And for the first time in her life, Grace felt no sympathy for him. Father, she said softly, dangerously, I found the papers. The Tennessee land deal. I know you were in business with Thomas Cole in 1872. Her father's face went from pale to ashen. Grace, I can explain. Then explain. Explain why Thomas Cole is dead and you are alive and wealthy. Explain why his daughter and our Abigail died within months of each other. Explain why Emmett Walsh, another member of your consortium, tried to shoot me yesterday and screamed about 1872 before he pulled the trigger. Samuel sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. When he spoke, his voice was muffled and broken. I never wanted any of this. You have to believe me, Grace. I never wanted anyone to die. But they did die, didn't they? And you know why. Her father was quiet for a long moment. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. Yes, he whispered. God help me, yes, I know why. Grace pulled up another chair and sat across from him. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. Then tell me everything. And Samuel Ashford, who had kept his secrets for 5 long years, finally began to speak. The story came out in fragments, like a dam breaking piece by piece. Samuel told her about the consortium, about the mysterious man who had approached them with promises of wealth from railroad expansion, about how they had not asked too many questions, had not wanted to look too closely at the source of their good fortune. We were storing goods in warehouses, Samuel said, his voice hollow. That was all we were told. Goods that needed to be moved quietly without drawing attention. The man, he called himself Blackwood, he said it was just avoiding excessive tariffs, finding more efficient routes. But it was not tariffs, Grace said. It was weapons. Her father nodded miserably. Thomas Cole discovered it. He was always more curious than the rest of us, always wanting to understand the full picture. He broke into one of the crates one night and found rifles. Military-grade weapons, hundreds of them. And he threatened to go to the authorities. Yes, he said we were committing treason, that he would not be part of it. Samuel's hands trembled. A week later his house burned, the whole family inside. And you said nothing. What could I say? Her father's voice cracked. Thomas was dead, his family was dead, and Blackwood made it very clear what would happen if any of the rest of us spoke out. He said our families would burn too, our wives, our children. Her stomach turned. So you kept quiet and took your blood money. I was a coward, Samuel admitted, tears streaming down his face now. I told myself I was protecting you and Abigail, that keeping silent was keeping you safe. But I was just protecting myself. And the girls, Sarah Cole, Margaret Walsh, Abigail, why did they die? Samuel's face crumpled. They saw something. Each of them, somehow they saw the weapons or the men moving them. Children, Grace. They were just curious children who wandered where they should not have wandered, and Blackwood could not risk them talking. But they were children, Grace said, her voice breaking. Abigail was 14 years old. She was innocent. I know. God forgive me, I know. Did you know? Before she died, did you know what was going to happen? The silence that followed was answer enough. Father, no, Grace whispered. Tell me you did not know. Blackwood came to me, Samuel said, the words dragged from him like shards of glass. He said Abigail had been seen near the warehouse. He said she was a liability. He gave me a choice, let her die quietly, an accident that no one would question or refuse, and watch my entire family burn like the coals. Grace stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She could not breathe, could not think past the roaring in her ears. You let her die. She said the words flat and dead. You chose yourself over your own daughter. I chose you, Samuel cried, reaching for her. If I had refused, we would all be dead. You, me, your mother, everyone. At least this way you survived. At least I saved one daughter. Grace stepped back away from his reaching hands, away from his tears and his excuses and his 5 years of lies. You did not save me, she said coldly. You just made me live with the weight of a death that could have been prevented. You made me grieve a sister whose murder you allowed. Grace, please. Who is Blackwood? Her father looked confused by the sudden question. What? Who is he? What is his real name? Where can I find him? I do not know. None of us knew his real identity. He always wore a hat, low kept to the shadows. The only distinguishing feature was a scar on his face, running from his temple to his jaw. A scar. Grace's mind raced. Who in Fort Smith wore a beard thick enough to hide such a mark? The image came unbidden. Sheriff Boyd, with his unusually heavy beard, unkempt for a man of the law. Number. It could not be, but Walsh had died in Boyd's custody, ruled a suicide with suspicious speed. Grace's stomach turned. If Boyd was Blackwood, they were in more danger than she had imagined. A scar. Grace filed that information away. And he is still here in Fort Smith. I do not know, Samuel said. After the girls died, the consortium dissolved. We scattered. I never heard from Blackwood again. I hoped it was over. It is not over, Grace said. Emmett Walsh tried to kill me yesterday. Someone is still playing this game, Father, and I intend to find out who. She turned to leave, but her father's voice stopped her. Grace, please. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but please do not do anything foolish. Blackwood is dangerous. If he is still alive, if he learns that you are asking questions, then he can come for me, Grace said, her voice hard. Maybe it is time someone in this family stood up to him instead of cowering in fear. She left her father there, broken and weeping, and climbed the stairs to her room. Her hands were shaking now, her breath coming in short gasps. She had wanted the truth, and now she had it, and it was more terrible than she had imagined. Her father had not killed Abigail with his own hands, but he had allowed her to die, had chosen his own survival over his daughter's life. And Grace did not know if that was better or worse than if he had been the actual murderer. She changed out of her blood-stained dress, washing her hands and face with mechanical precision. Then she crossed to Abigail's old room, the room that had been kept exactly as it was the day she died, a shrine to grief and guilt. Grace had not been in here in over a year. It hurt too much seeing Abigail's things still arranged on the dresser, her dresses still hanging in the wardrobe, her books still stacked beside the bed. But now, with her father's confession fresh in her mind, Grace looked at the room with new eyes. If Abigail had been killed because she saw something, had known something, she might have left evidence. A diary, perhaps like the one she used to keep. Notes. Something. Grace began to search systematically, pulling out drawers, checking behind furniture, running her hands along the baseboards. She was about to give up when her fingers caught on something loose beneath the window seat. A loose board. Heart-pounding, Grace pried it up and found a small space beneath just large enough for a slim volume bound in faded blue cloth. Abigail's diary. Grace lifted it out with fingers, quivered hands, and sank onto the bed, the diary clutched to her chest. For a long moment she could not bring herself to open it. This was Abigail's voice, her thoughts, her fears. Reading it felt like resurrection and violation all at once. But she had come too far to turn back now. Grace opened the diary to the first page, dated January 1872, and began to read. The early entries were ordinary observations about the weather, complaints about chores, dreams of someday traveling to New York or Boston. Reading them, Grace could hear her sister's voice so clearly it made her chest ache. But as the months progressed, the tone changed. The entries grew darker, more troubled. May 15, 1872. I saw something today that frightened me. There is a warehouse near the river, one that Father told me never to go near. But I was curious and I looked through the window. There were men inside, and they were unpacking crates. I only saw for a moment before one of the men looked up and saw me. He had a terrible scar on his face. He smiled at me, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a wolf seeing a lamb. Grace's blood ran cold. The scar. Blackwood. She read on her hands, shaking. May 20th, 1872. The man with the scar was outside our house today, just standing across the street watching. I told Father, and he got very angry. He said I must never go near the warehouses again, must never speak of what I saw. But he looked frightened, more frightened than I have ever seen him. I do not understand what is happening. June 3rd, 1872, Margaret Walsh came to visit today. She is my age 14, and her father knows my father from business. She told me her father has been acting strange, too nervous and short-tempered. She said she thinks the men are doing something bad, something dangerous. We promised to keep each other's secrets, to watch out for each other. Grace's hands tightened on the diary. Margaret Walsh, Emmett Walsh's daughter. Another girl who had died. She flipped forward, looking for the final entries, the ones that might explain what had happened in those last terrible days. August 10th, 1872. Margaret is dead. They say she fell down the stairs and broke her neck. But I know it was not an accident. She told me 2 days ago that she had seen the man with the scar again, that he had threatened her. Now she is dead, and everyone says it was just bad luck. I am so frightened. I think I am next. August 15th, 1872. I begged Father to protect me. I told him everything I saw, everything I know. He promised he would keep me safe. But I heard him crying in his study last night, and I do not think his promises mean anything anymore. August 20th, 1872. If anyone finds this, please know that I did not fall from any horse. I am terrified of horses. If I die and they say it was a riding accident, they are lying. The man with the scar is going to kill me, just like he killed Margaret. His name is... The entry stopped there, the rest of the page torn away. Grace sat frozen, the diary open in her lap, tears streaming down her face. Abigail had known, had written it all down, had left evidence, and it had not mattered. She had died anyway, and her death had been covered up, and no one had questioned the convenient lie of a riding accident. A sound from the doorway made Grace look up. Her father stood there pale and haggard. "You found it," he said quietly. "You knew about this. You knew she kept a diary. I looked for it after she died. I wanted to destroy it to make sure no one ever found it, but I could not find it." Samuel stepped into the room, his eyes on the slim volume in Grace's hands. "What does it say?" "It says you let her die when she came to you for help," Grace said, her voice shaking with fury and grief. "It says she knew she was going to be killed, and you did nothing." "I tried," her father whispered. "I went to Blackwood. I begged him to spare her, but he said it was too late, that she knew too much." "Then you should have gone to the law. You should have fought." "I was a coward," Samuel said simply, "and I have lived with that knowledge every day since." Grace stood clutching the diary. "This is evidence. Proof that Abigail was murdered, that there was a conspiracy. We can take this to the sheriff, demand a real investigation." Her father's laugh was bitter and broken. "Do you really think Sheriff Boyd does not already know? Do you think a conspiracy this large, this successful, could have operated without the law turning a blind eye?" The words hit Grace like a physical blow. The sheriff. Of course. How else could so many deaths be ruled accidents? How else could an arms smuggling operation run for years without being discovered? "Then who can we trust?" Grace asked. "No one," her father said. "That is what Blackwood taught us. Trust no one because anyone might be part of it." Grace looked down at her sister's diary, at the final entry torn away, and felt a desperate fury building in her chest. "I am taking this to Garrett Cole," she said. "He deserves to know the truth about what happened to his family, and together we are going to find Blackwood and make him pay for what he did." "Grace, no," her father said, panic in his voice. "You cannot trust Cole. He came here for revenge. He will not stop until I am dead." "Maybe you deserve to be dead," Grace said coldly. "Maybe we all do for what we have allowed to happen, but either way, I am done living in fear. I am done protecting secrets that should have been exposed years ago." She pushed past her father and out of the room, the diary pressed against her heart like armor. Grace found Garrett awake when she entered his room, his eyes alert despite the late hour. "Your father told you about the scar," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." Grace closed the door. "Garrett, I think I know who Blackwood is." His eyes sharpened. "Who? Sheriff Boyd." Garrett went very still. Then slowly he nodded. The beard. He wears it thick enough to hide a scar from temple to jaw. Walsh died in his custody, Grace said, and he ruled Abigail's death an accident without proper investigation. We need to be careful, Garrett said quietly. If Blackwood is who we think he is, we are already in his sights. Samuel called after her, but she did not stop. She had spent too many years stopping, listening, obeying. Now finally she was going to act. The next morning, with her father's reluctant permission and Dr. Matthews' blessing, Grace arranged for Garrett to be moved to the spare room in the Ashford house. The move was accomplished with the help of 2 ranch hands from Blackwell, who carried Garrett carefully upstairs and settled him into the narrow bed by the window. Samuel made himself scarce during the transition, but Grace could feel his presence in the house like a weight heavy and oppressive. Once Garrett was settled and the ranch hands had left, Grace closed the door to his room and pulled out Abigail's diary. "I need to show you something," she said. She sat on the edge of the bed and handed him the diary, watching his face as he read. She saw understanding dawn, saw grief and anger war in his expression, saw his hands clench around the slim volume. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes that held a terrible certainty. "This man Blackwood," he said. "He is the one who killed my family too. I would stake my life on it. My father said he has a scar, from temple to jaw." Garrett nodded slowly. "I remember the night of the fire. I was riding home and I passed a man on horseback heading away from our property. I only saw him for a moment, but the moon was bright enough that I saw his face. There was a scar exactly as your father described." "Then he is still out there," Grace said. "Still free. Still unpunished for everything he has done." "Not for long," Garrett said, his voice hard with purpose. "Your sister's diary gives us something we did not have before, proof that the deaths were connected, that there was a pattern. If we can identify Blackwood, if we can find evidence linking him to the murders, we can bring him to justice. Or we can kill him," Garrett said bluntly. Grace met his eyes. "Is that what you want, revenge?" "I want my family to rest in peace," Garrett said. "And I want to make sure no other young girls die because they saw something they were not meant to see. If that requires revenge, then so be it." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Grace opened it to find a young deputy standing there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Ashford, ma'am, I am sorry to disturb you, but I have news about Emmett Walsh." "What about him?" "He is dead, ma'am. Found him this morning in his cell. Hanged himself, they say." Grace felt the room tilt. Behind her, she heard Garrett swear softly. "Hanged himself," she repeated. "Are you certain it was suicide?" The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "That is what Sheriff Boyd said. Guess the guilt of trying to kill you was too much for him." Grace and Garrett exchanged a look. They both knew the truth. Walsh had not killed himself. He had been silenced, eliminated, before he could reveal what he knew about 1872 and Blackwood and the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. "Thank you for telling me," Grace said quietly. After the deputy left, Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. "He is cleaning up," she whispered. "Blackwood, whoever he is eliminating anyone who might talk." "Which means he knows we are asking questions," Garrett said. "He knows we're getting close." "Then we are in danger." "Yes." Grace pushed away from the door and crossed to the window, looking out at Fort Smith spread below, peaceful and ordinary in the afternoon light. Somewhere in this town, a murderer walked free. Somewhere Blackwood was watching, waiting, deciding who needed to die next to keep his secrets safe. And Grace Ashford, who had spent 5 years being dutiful and quiet and good, who had swallowed her questions and buried her grief, felt something new awakening inside her. Not fear, not grief. Fury. She turned back to Garrett, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and cold. "Then we stop asking questions quietly," she said. "We make enough noise that he has to come out of hiding. We force him into the open." "That is dangerous." "Everything about this is dangerous," Grace said. "But I am tired of being afraid. I am tired of letting evil men win because good people are too frightened to fight back." Garrett studied her face, and something in his expression shifted, warming with what might have been admiration or recognition. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "I am angry," Grace corrected. but perhaps that is the same thing. She moved back to the bed, sitting beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. For a long moment they sat in silence, two people bound by loss and fury and a determination to see justice done. Then, without planning it, without thinking about propriety or consequences, Grace leaned in and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss, not sweet or tentative. It was desperate and hungry, born of 5 years of suppressed emotion and the terrible knowledge that death could come at any moment. Garrett responded immediately, his good hand coming up to cup the back of her head, pulling her closer. For a few heartbeats, Grace lost herself in the kiss, in the warmth of his mouth and the strength of his body. She kissed him like he was salvation, like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath her feet. Then Garrett pulled back, his breathing ragged, his eyes dark with want and something else, regret perhaps. "Grace, we cannot," he said. "Why not? Because this," he gestured between them, "this thing between us, it is built on grief and anger and desperation. That is not love. That is survival." "Maybe survival is enough," Grace said. "It is not." Garrett's hand was still in her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You deserve more than that. You deserve someone who comes to you whole, not broken. Someone who can offer you a future, not just shared pain." "And what if I do not want to wait for someday?" Grace asked. "What if I want to feel something other than grief right now?" "I understand that," Garrett said gently. "God knows I understand that. But I will not take advantage of your pain, Grace. I will not be another man who uses you and leaves you with nothing but regrets." Grace closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. He was right. She knew he was right. But it hurt anyway, the rejection, even though she understood it came from honor rather than lack of desire. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Do not be sorry for wanting to feel alive," Garrett said. He pulled her close, not in passion, but in comfort, his good arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Just understand that when I kiss you again, and I will kiss you again, it will be because we have chosen each other, not because we are running from ghosts." Grace rested her head against his uninjured shoulder, letting herself take comfort in his warmth, his solidity, his quiet strength. "Promise me something," she said. "What? Promise me that no matter what we discover about my father, about your family, about Blackwood, we will see this through. Together." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he tightened his arm around her. "Together," he agreed. "Until the end." They sat like that as the afternoon light faded and evening crept across Fort Smith, two wounded souls, finding temporary shelter in each other's arms. Neither of them knew that the end was coming sooner than they thought, and that it would demand a price neither of them was prepared to pay. But for now, for this moment, they had each other. And in a world of lies and death and betrayal, that was enough. The days that followed Emmett Walsh's death were tense and strange, filled with waiting and watching. Garrett's strength returned slowly, his shoulder healing, though it would never be quite the same. Grace tended to him with careful efficiency, changing his bandages, helping him with the exercises Dr. Matthews prescribed, and all the while they planned. They needed to draw Blackwood out. They needed to force him to reveal himself. But how did you hunt a shadow a man whose real identity remained hidden even from those who had worked with him? The answer came from an unexpected source. It was late evening, nearly a week after Walsh's death, when Samuel Ashford finally knocked on the door to Garrett's room. Grace opened it to find her father standing there, looking 10 years older than he had a month ago, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Both of you." Grace stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Garrett sat up in bed, his expression wary, but not hostile. The three of them had maintained an uneasy truce in the house, circling each other like wounded animals, bound together by necessity, rather than trust. Samuel moved to the window, unable to look at either of them as he spoke. "I told you before that I was a coward," he began, his voice rough. "That I chose my own survival over my daughter's life. That is true. But it is not the whole truth." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "Blackwood gave me a choice," Samuel said, still staring out at the darkening street. "Let Abigail die in a convenient accident or refuse and watch my entire family burn. But there was a third option he offered, one I did not tell you about." What option? Garrett asked, his voice cold. He said I could save Abigail if I gave him something else, information about the other consortium members, where they were hiding what they knew, who they might have told. He said if I helped him tie up the loose ends, he would let my family live. Nausea rose in her throat. And what did you do? Samuel finally turned to face them, tears streaming down his weathered face. I gave him the information. I told him where Robert Hastings had fled to. I told him that Thomas Cole had kept records, hidden documents that proved what we had done. I betrayed them all to save you. But Abigail died anyway, Grace whispered. Yes, because after I had given him everything, Blackwood told me that Abigail had already seen too much, that she had written it down, kept a record. He said the only way to ensure our safety was to eliminate every witness, every piece of evidence. Samuel's voice broke. I begged him to reconsider, and he laughed. He said I had already made my choice when I gave up the others, that I had proven I would do anything to survive. He said he could not trust a man like that to keep his daughter quiet. So you got nothing, Garrett said flatly. You betrayed your friends, your business partners, and your daughter still died. Yes, Samuel said simply, and I have lived with that knowledge every day since. Every time I look at Grace, I see the daughter I saved and the daughter I failed. I see the price of my cowardice measured in bodies and broken promises. Grace stood frozen, trying to process this new information, this deeper layer of her father's guilt. Part of her wanted to rage at him, to scream that his betrayal had made everything worse. But another part, the part that had nursed him through illness and watched him age under the weight of his secrets, felt only a terrible, aching pity. Why are you telling us this now? She asked. Because Emmett Walsh is dead. Because I know Blackwood will not stop there. Because you are asking questions and making noise, and soon he will come for you too. Samuel moved closer, his hands outstretched in supplication. I cannot save you by keeping silent anymore. The only way to protect you now is to help you fight. Garrett leaned forward, his eyes sharp. What do you know that you have not told us? I know how to contact him, Samuel said, or at least I know where to leave a message that will reach him. There is a place, an old warehouse near the river. If you want to draw Blackwood out, I can help you do it. Why would he come? Grace asked. Because I will tell him that I have the documents, the ones Thomas Cole hid, the ones that prove the conspiracy. I will tell him I am ready to sell them to the highest bidder, that I am done being silent. Samuel looked between them. He will come because he cannot afford to let that evidence exist. It is a trap, Garrett said. Yes, Samuel agreed, but it is the only way. Grace and Garrett exchanged a long look. They both knew this was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but they also knew that Samuel was right. They could not wait for Blackwood to pick them off one by one. They had to force the confrontation while they still had the strength to fight. When? Grace asked. Tomorrow night, Samuel said. I will leave the message tomorrow morning. By nightfall, he will be there. And so will we, Garrett said grimly. That night, Grace could not sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 5 years of grief and questions. 5 years of living half a life, pretending that the world made sense when she knew it did not. Tomorrow night it would end. One way or another, the truth would come out, and people would die. Perhaps even her. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange calm, a clarity she had not experienced in years. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least it would be honest. At least she would face it with her eyes open, fighting rather than cowering. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She rose and opened it to find Garrett standing there, fully dressed despite the late hour, his arm still in a sling, but his eyes alert. Could not sleep either, he asked quietly. No. Walk with me. It was improper, dangerous even to walk alone with a man at night. But Grace was done worrying about propriety. She nodded and followed him downstairs and out into the cool night air. They walked in silence through the sleeping town, past dark storefronts and quiet homes until they reached the edge of Fort Smith, where the buildings gave way to open land. There, beneath a sky full of stars, Garrett finally spoke. If something happens tomorrow, he said, if I do not survive, I want you to know something. Do not talk like that. Grace, listen to me. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I came to Fort Smith for revenge. I was prepared to destroy your father, to burn down everything in my path, to get justice for my family. But then I met you." Grace's breath caught. "You made me remember that revenge and justice are not the same thing," Garrett continued. "You made me see that destroying your father would not bring my family back, would not ease the guilt I carry. You made me want something other than vengeance." "What do you want?" Grace asked softly. "I want a future," Garrett said, "not a past. I want to build something instead of tearing things down. And I want, God help me, I want you to be part of that future." He reached out with his good hand, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "But I will not ask you for that until this is over, until we have faced Blackwood and survived, until you are free to choose me without all this darkness between us." Grace leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "And if we do not survive, then at least I will die knowing that I found something worth living for." Grace opened her eyes and looked at him. This man who had taken a bullet for her, who had shared his pain and his purpose, who had shown her that strength could be gentle and that damaged souls could still recognize beauty. "Kiss me," she said. "Not because we are running from ghosts, not because we are desperate or afraid. Kiss me because you want to." Garrett smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look young and hopeful, despite everything. "I have wanted to since the moment you walked into that cabin by the cottonwoods and demanded to know why I was following you." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Grace did not pull away. She met him halfway, her lips finding his in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. It was different from their first kiss, the desperate one born of grief. This was a beginning, not an ending. A choice made freely, not a surrender to circumstance. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, both smiling despite the danger that waited for them. "Tomorrow," Garrett said, "we end this." "Tomorrow," Grace agreed. Hand in hand, they walked back through the sleeping town, two people who had found each other in darkness and were determined to walk together into the light, whatever the cost. The next evening, as the sun set over Fort Smith, Grace, Garrett, and Samuel made their way to the old warehouse district near the river. The buildings here were mostly abandoned relics of Fort Smith's rougher days, slowly rotting back into the earth. Samuel had left the message that morning using a dead drop he had been given years ago. If Blackwood was still watching, still maintaining his network, he would have received it. He would come. They positioned themselves carefully. Samuel would go inside the warehouse, visible through the dirty windows, appearing to wait alone. Grace and Garrett would hide in the shadows nearby, armed and ready to intervene when Blackwood revealed himself. It was not a sophisticated plan, but sometimes the simplest traps were the most effective. As darkness fell and lamps began to glow in distant windows, they took their positions. Grace crouched behind a stack of old crates, a rifle in her hands. Garrett had taught her to shoot over the past week, his patience and her determination combining to make her at least competent with the weapon. She was not a marksman, but at close range she could hit what she aimed at. Garrett was positioned across from her, his own rifle ready despite his injured shoulder. His face was calm, focused, the face of a man who had done this before. And Samuel stood in the warehouse, lit by a single lantern, waiting for the man who had destroyed so many lives. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching into eternity. Grace's legs began to cramp from crouching. Her hands grew slick with sweat on the rifle. She was about to suggest that perhaps Blackwood was not coming when she heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the main street. Grace tensed her finger, moving to the trigger. Across from her, she saw Garrett do the same. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and confident, walking with the easy stride of a man who had no fear. As he stepped into the pool of light spilling from the warehouse, Grace finally saw his face clearly, and her world tilted on its axis. Sheriff Boyd, the man who was supposed to uphold the law, who had ruled Abigail's death an accident, who had investigated Thomas Cole's fire and found nothing suspicious. The man who had arrested Emmett Walsh and then conveniently found him hanged in his cell. Sheriff Boyd was Blackwood. Grace saw Garrett stiffen in recognition as well, saw the fury that flashed across his face. All this time the man they had been hunting had been hiding in plain sight wearing a badge trusted by the entire town. Boyd stepped into the warehouse, and Grace could hear his voice carrying in the quiet night. "Samuel Ashford, I must say I am disappointed. After all these years of keeping your mouth shut, why start making noise now?" "I am tired, Boyd," Samuel said, and his voice shook only slightly. "Tired of being afraid. Tired of living with the blood on my hands." "Blood on your hands?" Boyd laughed, and the sound was cold and cruel. "Samuel, you never had the stomach for the actual killing. That was always my job. You just looked the other way and counted your money." "I know what I am," Samuel said, "and I am ready to face judgment for it. But first, I want to make sure you face it too." "Is that why you sent that message? Why you claimed to have Thomas Cole's documents?" Boyd moved closer, and Grace could see the scar now running from his temple to his jaw, usually hidden by his thick beard, but visible in profile. "We both know those documents burned with Cole's house." "Are you willing to take that risk?" Samuel asked. Boyd was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he smiled, and it was the smile Abigail had described in her diary, the smile of a wolf seeing a lamb. "No," he said softly, "I am not." He drew his gun with practiced speed and fired. The shot echoed through the warehouse district like thunder. Samuel jerked backward, his hand going to his chest, blood already spreading across his shirt. "No!" Grace screamed, rising from her hiding place without thinking. Boyd spun toward her voice, his gun tracking, but Garrett was faster. He fired, and Boyd staggered, hit in the shoulder, but the sheriff did not go down. Instead, he dove for cover behind a stack of barrels, returning fire. Grace ran toward the warehouse, toward her father, even as Garrett shouted for her to get down. She reached Samuel just as he collapsed, catching him as best she could, lowering him to the ground. "Grace," he gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." "Do not talk," Grace said, her hands pressing against the wound in his chest, trying futilely to stop the bleeding. "Just hold on. Please, Father, just hold on." "Could not let him kill you," Samuel said, his voice already fading. "Not you. Not my last daughter." Grace realized with horror what had happened. Her father had not been waiting passively for Blackwood. He had positioned himself between the door and where he knew Grace was hiding, had made himself the target, had taken the bullet meant for her. "You were supposed to stay back," Grace sobbed. "You were supposed to let us handle this." "Been running my whole life," Samuel said, his hand reaching up to touch her face with bloody fingers. "Time to stand still. Time to be brave." His eyes were already glazing, the light fading from them. Grace held him tighter, this father who had failed her in so many ways, but who in the end had given everything to save her. "I forgive you," she whispered, not knowing if it was true but needing to say it anyway. "Father, I forgive you." Samuel Ashford smiled just a little, and then he was gone. Grace knelt there holding her father's body, tears streaming down her face. Around her, she could hear gunfire, could hear Garrett and Boyd exchanging shots, but it all seemed distant and unreal. Then Garrett was there, pulling her down, shielding her with his body, as a bullet whizzed over their heads. "Grace, I need you to focus," he said urgently. "I know it hurts, but we have to finish this. Boyd is not going to let us walk away." Grace looked at him, then at her father's still form, then back toward where Boyd was hiding. Something crystallized inside her, hard and cold, something hard and cold and final. She picked up her rifle. "Where is he?" "Behind the barrels at the far end. He is hit, but still dangerous." Grace nodded. "Then we end it, together." They moved as one, Garrett going left, while Grace went right, flanking Boyd's position. The sheriff saw them coming and tried to retreat, but his wounded shoulder slowed him. He fired wildly, the bullets going wide, panic beginning to show in his movements. He had always been the hunter. He did not know how to be prey. Garrett reached him first, knocking the gun from Boyd's hand with the butt of his rifle. The sheriff fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted with pain and fury. "You think this changes anything?" Boyd spat. "You think killing me brings back your families? You are fools. We are not going to kill you," Garrett said, his voice deadly calm. "We are going to make sure you stand trial, make sure the whole world knows what you did. Who will believe you? I am the sheriff, a respected member of this community. You are nobody." "We have Abigail's diary," Grace said, stepping forward. "We have my father's confession. We have enough evidence to hang you 10 times over." For the first time, Grace saw real fear in Boyd's eyes. "You cannot prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We can," Grace said, "and we will." She raised her rifle, pointing it at Boyd's head, her finger on the trigger. It would be so easy. One bullet, and the man who had killed her sister, who had destroyed Garrett's family, who had terrorized an entire town, would be gone. Justice or revenge. In that moment they felt like the same thing. "Grace," Garrett said softly, "do not become him. Do not let him turn you into a killer." Grace stood there, the rifle steady in her hands, looking at the man who had taken everything from her. She thought of Abigail, 14 years old, and terrified. She thought of Sarah Cole, of Margaret Walsh, of all the girls who had died because one man had valued profit over life. She thought of her father bleeding out on the warehouse floor because he had finally found the courage to stand up. And she lowered the rifle. "You are not worth my soul," she said to Boyd. "You are not worth becoming like you." Behind them they heard voices, running, feet. Garrett's ranch hands from Blackwell, summoned by the gunfire, arriving with lanterns and weapons. In the chaos and confusion that followed, Boyd was bound and taken into custody. Not by his own deputies who might have helped him escape, but by ordinary citizens who had heard the gunshots and come to investigate. By dawn, word had spread through Fort Smith about what had happened. About the sheriff who was really a criminal, about the conspiracy that had poisoned their town for years, about Samuel Ashford's final act of redemption. Grace sat in her father's store as the sun rose, Abigail's diary open in her lap, and tried to feel something other than numb exhaustion. Garrett sat beside her, his good hand holding hers, silent and steady. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now there is a trial," Garrett said. "Boyd will hang, and we will testify, tell the truth about everything. And after that," Garrett was quiet for a moment, "after that we heal, or we try to at least." Grace looked at their joined hands, at the man who had come to her town, seeking vengeance, and had found something else instead, something fragile and new and worth protecting. "I cannot stay here," she said softly. "Fort Smith, this store, this house, it is all tainted now. Everywhere I look, I see ghosts." "Then leave," Garrett said. "Go somewhere new. Build something that is yours alone." "Come with me," Grace said, turning to face him. "We could go together. Start fresh somewhere. Neither of us has history or pain." Garrett's expression was infinitely sad and infinitely tender. "Grace, I want nothing more than to say yes. But we are not ready. You just lost your father. You are grieving and angry and broken, and so am I. If we run away together now, we will just be carrying our ghosts with us." "Then when," Grace asked, hating how desperate she sounded, "when we have both had time to heal, when we can come to each other whole instead of wounded, when we choose each other not because we need to escape, but because we want to build something together." Tears slid down her cheeks. "How long?" "I do not know," Garrett admitted. "A year maybe? Maybe longer." "And what if we do not find our way back to each other?" Garrett raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then it was not meant to be. But Grace, if you are meant to be mine and I am meant to be yours, time will not change that. Distance will not change that. We will find each other again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and tarnished. The bullet, the one engraved with "For Sarah." "Keep this," he said, placing it in her palm and closing her fingers around it. "Consider it a promise. When you are ready, when you have found yourself again, send this back to me, and I will come. Wherever you are, whatever you need, I will come." Grace held the bullet, feeling its weight, understanding what it meant. Not an ending, not a goodbye, just a pause. A chance for both of them to heal before they tried to build something new. "Where will you go?" she asked. "West, I think. Maybe California. I always wanted to see the ocean." Garrett smiled sadly. "And you?" "Denver." Grace said, the decision forming even as she spoke. "There is a women's college there. I will teach like Abigail wanted to. I will help others learn and grow. I will build the school my sister dreamed of." "That is good," Garrett said. "That is right." They sat there as Fort Smith woke around them, two people who had survived hell together and were now choosing to walk separate paths, at least for now. It hurt. God, it hurt like nothing Grace had ever felt. But it was also right. Sometimes love meant letting go. Sometimes it meant choosing growth over comfort, healing over need. The trial of Sheriff Boyd took 3 weeks. Grace and Garrett both testified, their words painting a picture of conspiracy and murder that shocked even the most cynical residents of Fort Smith. Abigail's diary was entered into evidence, her words from beyond the grave finally bringing her killer to justice. Boyd was convicted and sentenced to hang. On the morning of his execution, Grace did not attend. She had no need to see him die. His death would not bring back Abigail or her father or any of the others. It would just be one more ending in a story full of them. Instead, she spent that morning packing. The store had been sold. Her father's debts settled, his modest remaining wealth divided between charitable causes and Grace's own small inheritance. It was enough to start over, enough to build something new. Garrett came to say goodbye the day before she left for Denver. They stood on the porch of the house she had grown up in, the house she would never see again, and tried to find words for what they felt. "This is not forever," Garrett said, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "No," Grace agreed. "Just for now." Be happy, Grace Ashford. Build your school, teach your students, become the woman you are meant to be. "And you?" Grace asked. "What will you become?" Garrett smiled. "I do not know yet, but I am looking forward to finding out." He leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet and achingly brief. Then he turned and walked away, not looking back, his shoulders straight, despite the pain she knew he must be feeling. Grace watched him go until he disappeared around the corner. Then she went inside, closed the door on her old life, and prepared to begin her new one. 1 year later, Grace Ashford stood at the door of the Abigail Ashford Academy for Women, watching her 15 students file out after their lessons. The school was small, just 3 rooms in a converted house, but it was hers, built on her sister's dream and her own determination. She had healed here, found herself here, become someone she was proud to be, and now she was ready. Grace went inside and pulled out a small wooden box from her desk. Inside was the bullet Garrett had given her, the promise. She sat down and wrote, "Garrett, I am healed, I am whole, and I am coming to you. I will arrive in San Francisco on April 15th. Meet me at the harbor if you are ready. The bullet is my answer. Grace." She wrapped the bullet with the letter and mailed it that afternoon. 3 weeks later, Grace stood on the deck of a steamship entering San Francisco Bay, her heart pounding as the city came into view. The harbor was chaos, ships, sailors, cargo shouting, gulls screaming overhead. She scanned the crowded dock, searching. For a terrible moment, she thought he had not come. Then she saw him. Garrett stood at the end of the pier, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stopped her breath. He looked different. The haunted shadows were gone. He had healed too. When the gangplank was lowered, Grace did not wait. She ran. Garrett met her halfway, catching her as she threw herself into his arms. He lifted her off her feet, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. "You came," he said, his voice rough. "Did you doubt I would? I hoped, but I did not dare believe." Grace pulled back just enough to see his face. "Believe it. I'm here. I choose you." "And I choose you," Garrett said. He kissed her there on the dock, with the whole world watching. It was not their first kiss, but it was their truest one. The kiss of 2 people who had walked through hell and come out whole on the other side. When they finally broke apart, Garrett kept one arm around her waist. "I built a house," he said. 20 acres with an ocean view. There is room for a school if you want one." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You built me a school. I built us a future," Garrett corrected, "whatever shape you want it to take." Grace looked at this man who had saved her life, who had helped her find the truth, who had loved her enough to let her go, and trusted her enough to wait. "Then let us build it together," she said. Garrett pulled out something from his pocket, the bullet, the one she had sent him. "I kept this as a reminder," he said, "of pain and loss and everything we survived." "We do not need reminders anymore," Grace said. Together they walked to the edge of the dock. Together they threw the bullet into the bay. It disappeared into the blue water, sinking down among all the other relics of the past. Good riddance, Garrett said. Good riddance, Grace agreed. Hand in hand, they walked away from the harbor toward their future, not running from ghosts anymore, not haunted by what they had lost, but building something new from what they had found, each other. The trial of Sheriff Boyd had ended in execution. The conspiracy had been exposed. Fort Smith would heal in time as they had healed, but that was behind them now. Ahead lay California sunshine, ocean breezes, a house waiting to become a home, and land waiting to become a school. Ahead lay mornings waking beside each other, evenings watching the sunset over the Pacific, years of building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Ahead lay life, not survival, not mere existence, but life full and rich and chosen. Grace looked up at Garrett, at the man who had taken a bullet for a stranger and found love in the healing. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For waiting, for believing I would come back." Garrett stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Grace Ashford, he said, "I would have waited forever. You will not have to wait anymore," Grace promised. And there, on a California street, with the salt air in their lungs and the rest of their lives stretching before them, they kissed again. This time there was no desperation, no grief, no fear, just love, pure and simple and earned. The vigil was over. The long night had ended, and in the morning light Grace and Garrett walked forward together into the life they had chosen. The end.